Well, we all knew this day was coming, and it's finally here. The credit card debt in our country has jumped once again. The quarterly report from the New York Fed just came out, and I was just waiting to see this because we knew it was going to go up. We just didn't know by how much. It went up an additional $45 billion in just 3 months, guys. Think about that level of spending. $45 billion in just 3 months, okay? It went from $1.17 trillion in the previous report to now $1.21 billion. And I guarantee you, for every report we're going to get throughout the rest of this year, we're just going to continue to see that number climb because people are just charging up the cards like there's no tomorrow now. And you know, it's funny that they just always try to come up with an excuse of why this is happening, you know, and the funny excuse this time is because it was, you know, the fourth quarter results. They say a lot of it is driven by the holiday sales, you know, more people are spending money during the holidays, so naturally you're going to see more people charge up the credit card during this time. Like, yeah, I guess, but 45 billion? I don't think so, you know? This now puts credit card balances as a whole, just the amount of money that people owe, 7.3% higher than it was just 1 year ago. And I know I've covered credit card debt several times on this channel. This is not really a new thing that the debt levels are climbing, but it is new that the total amount of outstanding debt just continues to grow, guys. This number just got released. And the other thing that's starting to grow as well is the delinquency rates on this record high balance on credit cards, okay? Because they found out that 7.18% of balances transitioned to delinquency over the past year, which indicates that borrowers are having some difficulty repaying the bill. Here's one part of this story I definitely agree with. They say, no one should be surprised that the credit card debt hit another record high. So this is where we're at now with this in terms of the economy and just the way things are, is that, yeah, no one should be surprised. This is just kind of the way it is now. The credit card balances and the debt and the delinquencies are just going to continue to grow. And yeah, no big deal. Let's just all move on. Life and business as usual. Obviously, all of this is due to inflation. The cost of living is too high, and people are leaning more and more on credit cards than ever before. And you know, here's the worrying part of this, really, is that credit card balances were pretty stable up until we actually had the pandemic. You know, we hadn't seen these massive spikes in the amount of money that people were borrowing, and we didn't see the delinquency rates jump like this until the whole pandemic happened. And here's the worrying part about it too. They say consumer spending continues to remain strong despite high borrowing costs, so there's very little reason to believe that we won't continue to see new credit card debt records being set going forward. So it's actually the expectation that we are just going to see the balances continue to climb indefinitely into the future because consumer spending is still strong. And I think that they just say all this in a way that just makes things look good, right? They paint it with a brush that where it makes it sound like the economy is good. Consumer spending isn't strong, it's just high because everything costs a fortune. So people are naturally spending more money because they have to. It's not a choice. If you want to survive, if you want to have things that normal people buy in life, you have to spend more money. There is no option. And many people are choosing to put it on the credit card whether they want to or not. If it means that I will have it and it's on the credit card and my debt goes up, or I don't have it and I don't have it on the credit card bill, almost everybody chooses the first option. Credit card percentages are in the mid 20% right now. So most people are paying anywhere between 20 and 28% on their APR if you can't pay off the bill when it comes in full. But this isn't a big deal, right? Because Americans are making more money. That's what they always tell us, that the wages have been going up. So yeah, even though the spending has been going up and the debt levels are going up, we're in good shape because, you know, people make more money now. In the last quarter of 2024, they say that wages went up 3.8% on average, and inflation was only at 2.9%. Although one thing we're going to talk about later in this video is some of the most recent inflation data, which kind of pushes back against that as well. And they say, you know, this means that wages are outpacing inflation, which gives workers slightly more buying power. And one thing I've always said that counteracts this is they talk about wages going up 3.8% and inflation only being 2.9%. They never mention the part that the inflation numbers are actually wrong. They're not accurate. That's the first problem. And they also never mention the fact that your wages aren't your wages. Whatever you get an increase in pay, you don't get to keep all of it. You get an increase in pay, and then what happens is you have to pay taxes like everybody else. You don't get to keep that full 3.8% increase in pay. And I would say that even if these numbers were accurate, right? Even if the pay was going up 3.8% and inflation was only 2.9%, then that's still not really enough, because by the time you factor in everybody's actual individual level of inflation that they have, you're not in a situation where people can actually afford to continue keeping up with the cost of living. Housing is the biggest issue on top of everybody's mind, whether you're a renter or an owner. They say that depending on where you live, housing is now taking up anywhere between 25% and 60% of someone's annual wages, guys. And here's another thing to think about as well. We talk about how the housing market is sitting at 30-year lows right now in terms of purchases in the housing market. We're just not seeing a lot of activity. A lot of that is going to continue, not just because people can't afford the house, not just because people are choosing not to buy, but also for another reason, and that is called debt to income ratio. As we see these credit card balances rise, and as we see the average person have a car payment of $700 to $1,000 a month, you're going to see a situation where people literally can't qualify to buy homes because their debt to income ratio is just too high. And for anybody curious, I'm walking along the shores of Biscayne Bay here in Oleta State Park. It's just so beautiful over here. Because as these balances on credit cards continue to rise, and as people continue to lean on them more just for regular items to stay afloat in life, that's less borrowing power that they're going to have to be able to buy a home potentially in the future. So anybody who's been planning on buying a home might not be able to, even if they want to, because their debt to income ratio is just too high. But all these stories, they just keep talking about, spending. Spending is higher, even though it's slowing, spending is still higher than it was pre-pandemic. Like, yeah, no kidding, it's higher than it was pre-pandemic. People have to spend more. This is not optional. I'm spending more, you're spending more. Everybody who spends money is spending more. Think about this for a minute. Say you have a credit card balance of $5,000 at a 22% interest rate, which is probably conservative these days. You are looking at a situation where, after a year's time, you just added up an extra $1,100 in interest, guys. That means that even if you don't spend an extra dime on that credit card, your balance went from $5,000 to $6,100 in the span of a year. So you can see how this situation is going to continue to spiral out of control at this pace. And it's really not fair either, because say you can nail down a savings account right now with 4.5% interest. If you were to put that same $5,000 in there, you would end up with only $225 in interest by the time the year is over. And I've complained about this before on the channel, but you see, all of the interest rates for everything are still high. Buying a house, it's high. Credit card rates are high. Car loan rates are still high. But one thing that has dropped over the past 6 to 8 months has been interest rates for savings accounts. So people who are actually trying to do the right thing and get ahead are still being screwed by the interest rate situation. Like, is it better than it was before they started raising interest rates? Yeah. But with how bad inflation is and how high the cost of living is, the returns still aren't great compared to what these credit card companies are getting or the mortgage companies are getting. So basically, it's not a surprise either that the amount of money that people are saving at this point has dropped to practically nothing. Before the pandemic, it was common for people to save about 6 to 8% of their income, and that was kind of like the savings rate back then. And then when things started looking bad, the savings rate dropped to around 3 to 4%. And now it's even worse than that. People are burning through cash faster than ever right now, and they're hoping that somehow tomorrow's paycheck is going to keep up with today's bills. And if it doesn't, don't worry, we'll just put it on the credit card. And I honestly, I'm not saying that that's how everybody thinks. I'm not saying that everybody's like, oh, let's just throw it on the credit card like it's no big deal. I think a lot of people do it because they have to, guys. They really do. Obviously, you're going to always have the irresponsible folks that, just buy things that they shouldn't with their credit card and live beyond their means. But I don't think that's what a lot of people are doing. I mean, I would say about half of this credit card debt is probably out of necessity and the other half is out of stupidity. Another telltale sign that shows us what's going on with the economy and shows you that people are so tight on money is that people are continuing to borrow more money against their retirement accounts. You know, they're so strapped for cash today that they've decided that it's worth it to borrow money from their future self in retirement in hopes that they might be able to catch up. Because one thing that they're talking about is the amount of 401k hardship withdrawals have been on the rise, although the only silver lining in that is the amount that people are pulling out is smaller. So there's more people making withdrawal requests, but at smaller amounts, probably because they're leaning on other sources of debt too, like the credit card bill, like the home equity line of credit, like the personal loan. People will turn to other things as well. And we know that inflation is the reason for all of this, right? We know, I mean, life was already kind of tough before the pandemic happened, but that just made it so much worse for everybody because the cost of living shot up far more than anybody could have imagined. Well, we just got some recent inflation data, which is still going in the wrong direction and also proves what I've been saying from the beginning, that the Fed has been dead wrong about their decision to start cutting rates back in December. I made several videos about that, and I made a video as soon as the rate cut happened saying that that was a mistake. And then they come out acting all surprised that inflation is not going away, you know, because the latest CPI report came in at 3%, guys, which is higher than it was the month before. Surprise, surprise. And the goal is 2%. So what's going on? What's going on is the Fed never was serious about lowering inflation. Their fight on inflation was fake. It was all smoke and mirrors. It was all stage games to make it look like they're fighting inflation, when in reality, all they were doing is slowing it down. And guess what? According to the most recent inflation report, the CPI rose at more than 6% when you're talking about an annualized rate, guys, and that is the government's official number. So think about that. The CPI is the Consumer Price Index, and they're saying the official number is that it went up 6%. And a good rule of thumb that I just kind of made up at some point is that we can just kind of double the numbers that they give us, and that's probably closer to the reality. So that means the reality is, over the past year, that prices have actually gone up about 12% for most people. Think about that, 12%. And we just talked about a little bit ago here how the wages in 2024 went up 3.8%. So is that really enough to keep up with a 12% increase in cost of living? Probably not. So that comes back to the credit card story. Is it a shocker that the credit card balances are skyrocketing out of control? No. This is obviously bad news for consumers, it's bad news for the Federal Reserve, and it's bad news for bonds and stocks, and it's even worse for people who are coming up on retirement or who just retired and can't really afford a whole bunch of bad bond investments or higher inflation to this magnitude either. Here's something interesting that I've never seen on one of my walks before. Somebody just put a post-it note here. Your passion glistens against the waves of the ocean. How profound. So this data makes it glaringly obvious that starting to cut rates back in September was a huge mistake. And it also probably shows us that it was politically motivated, because that was a couple of months before the election took place, and the idea was probably, let's lower rates, you know, a little bit, try to juice the economy, try to make things look better than they really are for a little while, and try to get Biden reelected. And it didn't work because people aren't that stupid. Now, obviously, inflation is even worse, and it's going to be Trump's problem, so it's going to be interesting to see if he's going to be able to fix this problem at all. And it's only really been, you know, a few weeks, so we don't know. But it looks like we very well may be entering a time of stagflation. And stagflation is a time when we have high inflation, but the economy is not growing. In fact, it might even be shrinking. And this is like a recipe for disaster, especially for the Fed, because the Fed doesn't have any ammo for stagflation. They just sit there and pray that it hopes and that it doesn't happen, right? Their idea with stagflation is let's just make sure we never hit a period of stagflation. But what happens if we do? What happens if the situation we're in right now is stagflation? Well, basically the Fed is going to be powerless. And most likely what they will do is they'll probably just leave interest rates the same that they are right now for a very long time. In fact, we might not even see any further interest rate cuts in 2025 due to how bad things are getting. The first quarter is not even over yet. This is another reason why I've told people time and time again on the channel that they should own some gold and silver, because this is basically the only thing you can own that's real money and that will continue to keep up with all the inflation that we're experiencing, if not even outpace it. In fact, gold has been the best performing asset of 2025, and it's only the middle of February. And I don't think that's a coincidence, guys. I think the world in general is starting to get on board with the fact that, you know what, this is a problem that's not going to go away, maybe ever, and it might just continue to get worse, referring to inflation. So now more people are aware of that. They say that even when you adjust for inflation, gold today is actually more expensive per ounce than any time since at least the 1920s. Well, what happened back then? We had the Great Depression. I've seen so many people say in the comments over the past couple of years when I mentioned the word recession here on the channel, like, no, Michael, correction, it's not a recession, it's a depression. And I have to agree with these people. I think that's the situation we're heading into. Whether you want to admit it or not, doesn't really matter. You see, because here's the problem a lot of people don't think about, is it doesn't really matter what you think. It only matters what's really going on. You know, it only matters what's actually happening, guys. You can sit there and bury your head in the sand and pretend that the inflation numbers are good or that they're not going in the wrong direction right now and that the economy is still great, which a lot of people were especially doing before the election. Now more people are open to the fact that the economy's not good now that we have changed presidents. It doesn't matter what I say about it or what you think about it, because what matters is prices are going up. What matters is it's still almost impossible for everybody to afford a home. What matters is the household debt levels are spiraling out of control. That stuff matters. That ultimately is our economy. You also have the producer price index that just came out. That went up 0.4%. And the estimate was 0.3%, so slightly higher than expected. And so you can see the other theme here is that inflation expectations are still that it's going to rise. You know, nobody's actually thinking that it's going to go down. Not even the markets are predicting that. The only reason the markets aren't completely collapsing is because the inflation reports are largely coming in line with predictions. Also, excluding the food and energy, the core PPI was up 0.3%, which was also in line with the forecast. Like those little half a point increases here, half a point increase there, 0.4% increase here. All that stuff adds up throughout the year. Over the past year, the PPI increased 3.5%, which is well ahead of the Fed's projected outlook on the PPI. And so now the betting markets are saying that the Fed likely isn't going to lower interest rates at all until at least October this year. So think about how wrong they were last year. You know, last year the betting market said there was going to be 6 rate cuts in 2024, and there ended up only being 3, all at the end of the year. And right now, they're only predicting 1 in October. So at best, maybe there will be 2, if this is even correct. But I think since we're entering a period of what looks to be stagflation, that we aren't going to see any interest rate cuts. Whether the Fed will have the guts to actually raise interest rates, which would be the right thing to do, I don't know. We'll find out. But that's what actually needs to be done. You can go back and look at my previous videos, guys. Go look at the videos I was making in the summer of 2024. That's what I said every time I talked about the economy in one of these videos. The Fed should be raising interest rates. They just lowered them and got us into an even bigger mess than we were already in. Here's the most worrying part about this too, is that we actually had revisions to the December numbers, which also makes inflation look even worse, because the December numbers was initially an increase of 0.2%, but now it's been revised up to 0.5%. Another thing we're probably going to continue to see happen throughout the rest of this year is the revisions come in consistently worse than the original report. That was a big theme that we saw last year in 2024. And here's the thing. The 0.5% increase in the CPI that we just saw in January of 2025 is the largest increase in 17 months, guys. Think about that. The Fed only started cutting rates back in September, so it was just 4 or 5 months ago, and now we are seeing the largest jump in 17 months, guys. That's a year and a half. This is all while the rents and hotels and apartment costs are up 4% year over year. Grocery bills have been skyrocketing for people, and just eggs alone are double what they were a year ago, if you can even find any. In fact, I went out last night to try to get some eggs, and nobody had any except for Publix, and the ones they had were all like the conventional cheap eggs, like the worst ones you can buy for your health. That's all they had. It really sucks for me because I love eggs. I eat eggs every single day. But luckily, I just went out for a re-up. I still have some eggs because I buy a lot each time I go to the grocery store. So yeah, none of this is actually good news, guys, and I'm not surprised that it isn't. And really what I hope that people take away from these videos is just looking at the state of affairs, looking at the state of the economy and saying, wow, at least my life isn't that bad. Or wow, if it is that bad, maybe I should do something to pull out of that. Maybe there's a better way to live. Maybe I don't have to be on this path of destruction. So that's how I hope that these videos impact people. Either way, I want people to feel good about their current situation, knowing that they're doing better than most, or I want people to take some action and be able to get a little bit of motivation from this to make things better for themselves and their families. If I can do that and it just helps, a couple people per video, then that really makes a huge difference in the world in the end, and that's something I'm proud of. So if you enjoy this video, make sure you subscribe to the channel, and if you don't want to wait for my next video to come out, check out this one on the screen right over here, and I'll see you in the next one.